Hello everyone. Thanks for coming to our symposium titled Accessing to Fractional Magnitude from Perception to Higher Cognitions. My name is Yunji Park. I'm a postdoc at Stanford and previously in Wisconsin Madison. And I will briefly outline our talk and we'll go right into the actual discussions. As you all know, these days, there has been a growing interest on fractions knowledge, and studies have investigated what sorts of external representation might best support fractions processing ability in an effort to enhance fraction knowledge. And so far, various perspectives on these external representations brought different approaches and interpretations on its application to real educational setting. So today's symposium wanted to discuss different perspectives on this external representation of fraction magnitude and think about how we might best utilize it. Oops. So the symposium will have 4 speakers, and this is our cool lineup. And Parnika and I will start to discuss from perceptual approaches to non-symbolic representation of fraction magnitude. And Jake and Miriam gradually will talk about the view from higher cognitions and important factors that might involve in understanding non-symbolic fractions representations. So that being said, I will start to talk about the perceptual processing of non-symbolic and symbolic fractions magnitude. And we particularly interested in a cross-format comparison across multiple non-symbolic and symbolic formats. And this is work with my previous advisor, Percival Matthews. So as I just said, these days, a lot of people got interested in fractions knowledge, and it is because of its importance. So fractions knowledge is important for our daily life, even with young kids when they try to divide their snacks evenly. And recent research also found that it is also important for mastering complex and advanced mathematics like algebra, which can be a key to university. So with this emphasis on fractions learning, researchers try to understand fraction learning better. So, and one line of research suggested a possibility that humans have intuitive, perceptually based access to primitive fractions concept when they are presented with non-symbolic graphical representations like these 2 dot arrays, like the ratio between yellow dot and blue dots, and the ratio between 2 line lengths. And they also said this perceptual ability eventually will help symbolic fraction learning. So, and our team called this basic perceptual ability as a ratio processing system, RPS, which dedicates to process non-symbolic ratio. And the existence of the RPS was supported by the evidence that even 6-month-old infants and monkeys can process non-symbolic ratio magnitudes. So also, the studies really have shown that the discriminability between 2 non-symbolic ratios relates to fractions knowledge among both children and adults group. However, how this non-symbolic might be used to support reasoning with fraction symbols is not still fully understood. So one question of interest is whether RPS processed representations may provide benefits for access to rational number magnitude when they presented symbolically. So some studies have showed that that adults and children can compare fractions magnitude across non-symbolic and symbolic formats without substantial translation cost. However, so far, the studies have used the limited types of non-symbolic representations in each individual study. Also, we do not know how these different non-symbolic ratios are differently accessed across fractions, across formats. So to resolve these questions, these 2 questions, so we investigated whether ratio information can be similarly accessed across multiple non-symbolic formats, and also the degree to which non-symbolic formats affects cross-format comparison between non-symbolic and symbolic fractions. So in experiment 1, we investigated comparison across multiple non-symbolic ratio formats. And we participants was adults like 92 undergrads. And we used the task, the formats across task from our previous study. And this study looked at the developmental changes in RPS processing ability with these multiple ratio comparison formats, line, circle, blob, dots. And people choose which ratio is larger in this comparison task among the ratio presented by two line lengths or circle areas or blob areas and number of dot arrays. So we named this comparison as a same format comparison. And along with this, we were interested in cross-format design. So 4 different formats brought the 6 possible cross-format comparisons. And participants did the 6th type of comparison, cross-format comparison, along with the same format design. And if we now take a look at the results, you can see this graph. The graph shows accuracy on the y-axis, and depending on the types of the format. As we all can expect, participants show better accuracy in the same format comparison than cross-format comparisons. So if we see each format's performance, in the same format comparison, there was a clear format effect. We can see the order of line, circle, blob, dots, line comparison, circle comparison, blob, and dot comparison. As the format has more complex visuals, accuracies decreased. And in the cross-format comparison, the accuracy seems also depend on the types of format that was compared. So usually when comparison involved dot arrays, it was significantly lower than other formats. Adding to this, we also looked at whether participants equally judged the amount of magnitude in different format across different distance. So since the graph I will introduce is not so familiar with some people, so I will first take a case of circle and blob ratio format design. So this design. So in the graph, y-axis shows the probability that people judged blob ratio is larger. So 0.05 means that people judged circle and blob ratio as the same size. So also x-axis shows the distance between blob and circle. So positive value means where blob ratio is larger than circle ratio, and negative values mean where blob ratio is smaller than circle ratio. And hypothetically, if people's responses were all correct, the graph should look like this. But since people's responses also depend on the distance and it's kind of messy, so it will draw S-curve response like this. And in the case of circle versus blob ratio, it looked almost exactly like this, likely because it presents the same magnitude dimensions, the area dimensions. And in other formats case data, you can see beautiful S-curve data in all comparisons. Also, this graph may not clearly show there were significant distance effects in each format. And this data indicate that people were able to access abstract ratio information, although formats were different. So even though you can see the graphs are a bit shifted toward the left side, as you can see, it means there were a bit of bias that people tend to judge the right ratio. I mean, in the format name, in this case, the people judge blob ratio as a larger. So overall, people tend to perceive ratio presented with areas is larger than line length, or the ratio presented with the numbers is larger than continuous magnitude. But the important thing is they are able to access abstract ratio information in all cross-format design. And next, we wonder the case of cross-format comparison with symbolic fractions. Will some of previous studies be replicated and will be applied to other formats? So we conducted a cross-format comparison task with 40 undergrad, and participants choose which fractional ratio is larger. And we first looked at the format effect, and you can see, similar to the experiment 1's result, in the order of comparisons involving line, circle, blob, dot, accuracy significantly decreased. And similar to what I explained earlier in experiment 1, here y-axis shows the probability that people judge fraction is larger, and x-axis shows that the distance between symbolic and non-symbolic ratio. And you can see similar S-curve graphs as experiment 1, which shows they were able to compare symbolic and non-symbolic ratio by accessing abstract magnitudes. If we take a bit closer look, the trend of research shifted toward the right side, which means people tend to judge non-symbolic ratio is larger than fractions. However, the important thing is people were able to access abstract ratio information. So if we summarize all the about question 1, ratio information were able to be accessed similarly across different format comparison. And you can see this based on the S-curve and distance effects. And also the differences between within and cross-format comparison of non-symbolic comparison mainly depended on the types of non-symbolic representation that was compared, not the type of same or cross-format comparison. And about question 2, we also found people were able to access ratio information similarly across symbolic and non-symbolic comparisons. And also the differences between cross-format comparisons depended on the types of non-symbolic representations that was compared. So this cross-format comparison results support the existence of perceptual access to abstract ratio information. So based on this research, future intervention studies can investigate if the this perceptual ability can be leveraged to promote fractional learning. So lastly, I'd like to thank you, my advisor, Percival Matthews, and all the undergrad participated to our study. I think I'm all done. I think I can take one question because of your like 3 talks lined up. Oops. If there is no questions, then we will go to the next talk. Parnika, are you ready?
Yeah. Yeah. Can I start?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Today, I'll present our studies on understanding fraction knowledge in adults with developmental dyscalculia. So as Yunji has previously mentioned, fractions are really important for high school and mathematics school curriculum. However, they are also important for understanding case fatality rates in the context of a pandemic, making sound financial decisions. They also form foundations for complex mathematical concepts such as algebra and calculus, and might aid individuals in their future job prospects. Some common difficulties that have been identified within typically achieving individuals as well as individuals with mathematic difficulties with fractions include inability to access the holistic magnitude of fraction, which often leads individuals to process the whole number bias, which is basically when individuals apply whole number strategies to fraction concepts. Another difficulty is with the varied and complex fraction arithmetic procedures, such as in fraction multiplication, individuals are required to process the operation across the numerators as well as the denominators. However, the same strategy might not apply for fraction addition problems. And so while difficulties have been found in typically achieving in individuals, fractions might be even more difficult to process for adults as well as children with mathematics disabilities. Mathematics disability or dyscalculia has been shown to be prevalent among 3 to 7% of school-going children, and it is a basic deficit in the numerical skills such as counting, calculations, and recalling mathematical facts. It has also been shown to have some other difficulties, such as in working memory, language, and attention, making it a heterogeneous disorder, and has been shown to be attributable to both genetic as well as environmental factors. So while prior research has focused on understanding difficulties of typically achieving individuals and children with mathematics disability, not a lot of research exists on understanding difficulties with adults with mathematics disability. So the first objective of the study was to examine the difficulties encountered by adults with mathematics disability when processing fractions. And for this study, what we did was we recruited typically achieving adults and adults with MD and asked them to complete a paper-based untimed fraction test. This test was designed in accordance with the French national curriculum standards, as well as a prior study on children with mathematics disability. And what we see is 5 fraction concepts, which are fraction arithmetic, where participants have to add across the fractions and add a fraction to a whole number. Fraction number line, where participants have to place the fractions on the graduated number line or find the fractions that correspond to the points on the number line. Word problems, symbolic representation, which involves transcoding of fraction numerals to the word form and vice versa, and fraction concepts, which involve concepts such as part whole, fraction equivalence, as well as magnitudes. And so what we see in the result is for symbolic representation, fraction concepts, and word problems, there is not much of a difference in performance between typically achieving adults and adults with mathematics disability. So here on the graph, we see that this is the percentage score on each of these competencies. The blue dots represent the individuals, and this middle line represents the mean of the scores on each of these competencies, and the error bars represent the confidence intervals. However, we did see that for fraction number line, as well as for fraction arithmetic, there was a significant difference in performance between these two groups, where adults with MD performed significantly lower than typically achieving adults. And so we wanted to see next, what are some of the error patterns that these adults exhibit on fraction number line and fraction arithmetic. And so we did an exploratory error pattern analysis. And here, this is just one example where we see how adults with mathematics disability show similar error patterns that have been observed in prior research on typically achieving adults and children with mathematics disability. So here we see that they are unable to reduce the fractions. They're also unable to understand the subunits within the multiple units of the number line. And here they are counting the tick marks instead of the parts that have been segmented. On fraction arithmetic, we see the classic error pattern where they are adding across numerators and denominators in both like denominators as well as unlike denominators. And so one of the reasons could be that there might be an underlying deficit, or there might be an underlying inability to access the non-symbolic relational magnitudes, which is leading individuals across the board having difficulties, having these persistent difficulties. And so what we wanted to see was do they have an underlying deficit in the ratio processing system? And as Yunji has already mentioned in her presentation, so I would not be going in the details, but similar to the approximate number system that has been posited to perceive and estimate non-symbolic magnitudes and might contribute to symbolic number skills, recently, ratio processing system has been shown to perceive and estimate non-symbolic relational magnitudes and might underlie symbolic rational number skills. So it is defined as a set of neurocognitive architectures that support the representation and processing of non-symbolic ratios. So here, we wanted to see whether these persistent difficulties that adults with MD faced with fractions, as well as what prior research has shown on other individuals, do they arise due to the inability to access the non-symbolic ratios? For this, we adapted a match to sample task that was already there on a poster, and we presented adults with two blocks, symbolic fractions and non-symbolic ratios, which had 3 stimuli: the target, the match, and the distractor. And the comparison difficulty between the match and the distractor was modulated. So half of the trials had a large ratio between the match and the distractor, making it easier for the participants. And the other half had small ratio between the match and the distractor. The numerator of the distractor was also either identical to the target or different from the target to control for componential processing skills. And so hypothetically, if RPS does underlie both non-symbolic and symbolic processing, we would see a graph something similar to this, where on the y-axis, we see the proportion correct or the accuracy. And on the x-axis is the ratio of ratios, which is large in half of the trials and small in the other half. So if for non-symbolic ratios and symbolic fractions, the performance does depend on the ratio of ratio effect, then we would see this performance where the larger ratio of ratios are easier to process and hence have a higher accuracy, and thus are accessing the RPS. However, if RPS is not utilized, then we would see something similar to this kind of a pattern where performance will not depend on the ratio of ratios. And if the RPS is present for non-symbolic but not for symbolic processing, a similar graph to this would be observed where performance accuracy does depend on the ratio of ratio effect for non-symbolic line ratios, but not for symbolic fractions. And so 13 adults with developmental dyscalculia participated in this study. And what we found out was, irrespective of whether the numerator of the distractor and target was identical or different, we did find this ROR effect or the ratio of ratio effect for line ratios, where individuals were able to perform better on large ratio of ratios as compared to the small, and this was not observed for symbolic fractions. Therefore, in conclusion, we saw that adults with mathematics disability do show persistent difficulties in number line and arithmetic, and these difficulties are similar to errors and misconceptions in prior research on typically achieving children, adults, and children with mathematics disability. So one reason could be an underlying deficit in the RPS. However, what we saw was the adults are still able to access the magnitudes of the non-symbolic ratios, suggesting for an unimpaired RPS. But they're unable to utilize this ability for processing symbolic fraction understanding, thereby showing a limited role of the RPS in adults with mathematics disability. With this, I would like to thank my advisors, the neuropsychologist, and the research interns that helped in the data collection, all the participants, and the funding organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Parnika. If you guys have any questions, please put on the chat or you can speak up.
Can I ask a question? Or no, somebody else.
Yes.
Okay, so what would you expect to find in typically developing adults on your ratio of ratios task?
So we did do this task with typically achieving adults and with children who just got introduced to fractions in 4th and 5th grade. And in both these populations, we found out similar results, that they were able to access the non-symbolic relational magnitude. So they did show that signature effect. However, they could not utilize that for symbolic fractions. So irrespective of the ability or the mathematics skill, across the board we found that yes, the RPS exists
for the non-symbolic, but then for the symbolic, everybody was flat.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting.
And additionally, we also did cross-format comparison, something to what Yunji showed, only typically achieving populations. And there we did see the ROR effect. So when they are forced to utilize approximation across non-symbolic and symbolic fractions, they do show the ROR effect, but only in symbolic fraction tasks, they did not show that.
And what were the order that you did the trials, and did you counterbalance it? Because I think some of the interesting thing that goes on in Ed and Percival's tasks is that they get these great ratio effects for symbolic, but maybe it's because they're intermixed with other non-symbolic, and that's maybe priming those magnitude representations.
That's a really great question. So yes, we did counterbalance these tasks. But yeah, I think this is one thing that I'm interested in, that if suppose half of I wanted to analyze these results further, that if suppose in half of the trials, individuals are seeing non-symbolic ratios first, do they use that understanding to process symbolic fractions? Something that I have to further analyze, but it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, that would be really cool.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Then Yeah, if you guys have any questions like throughout talk or after the talk, please put on the chat. And it seems like Jake, it's your turn.
All right, great. Yes, full screen for everyone.
Oh, yes.
Great. Yeah, so hello, my name is Jake McMullen, and together with Hilma Halme and Minna Hanola Sormanen, today I'm going to present some work we've been doing looking at the role of math anxiety in symbolic and non-symbolic relational reasoning. And yeah, well, the basic idea is looking at kind of these processes within formal fraction knowledge, and also the concept of SFOR, or spontaneous focusing on multiplicative relations. So we're moving beyond RPS into other aspects of non-symbolic relational reasoning. Yeah, and the basic premise here is that, of course, kids do have some non-symbolic proportional reasoning skills, even in early childhood, as Percival and colleagues have shown, and I won't go into that in detail, but then, of course, they struggle then when it comes to the transition to symbolic fractions. One view of this, and one view of examining individual differences in fraction knowledge is, of course, looking at the ratio processing system. Our approach looks at it from a different angle and looks at it from the perspective of other influences on the transitions to symbolic fractions. My work with my colleagues for the past coming on 10 years now is looking at one potential bridge, which is what we could describe as a tendency to spontaneously focus on multiplicative relations. With young children, we involve tasks like this, so they weren't necessarily proportional relations, but relations between sort of similar quantities in different what's the word I'm looking for? Splitting them up. Yes. And we found that this was actually particularly important after fractions are introduced, that we saw that spontaneously focusing on the multiplicative relations, for instance, involved in this task where students were asked to describe how a set of objects have changed, not specifically noting that they are mathematically changing, but seeing if students notice the multiplicative relation in the changes and spontaneously use that in their descriptions. We found that spontaneous recognition of multiplicative relations was predictive of their fraction development over, for instance, a 1.5 year period, and even onward up into other aspects of relational reasoning in mathematics, such as algebra. So that's sort of a positive influence that we're examining in the present study. And the more negative one is the hindrance of math anxiety, which is known to affect students' performance, especially with advanced skills, including fraction knowledge. So that the math anxiety seems to sort of inhibit the performance in a way that maybe could, for instance, have an effect on their ability to kind of recognize the non-symbolic and the sort of proportional reasoning that they can use in everyday life. But then when it goes into sort of formal fraction context, mathematical classroom context, the sort of math anxiety might kind of cause them to not be able to or might interfere with that. So that's the basic idea of where we're coming here. Of course, up until now, as far as I know, as far as we know, no one's really examined both math anxiety and SFOR in the same study, in particular in looking at how those both are related to formal fraction knowledge. So we aim to investigate at the intersection of SFOR and math anxiety in relation to fraction knowledge, and asked 2 questions in the present study. How does math anxiety differ across non-symbolic and symbolic relational reasoning tasks? So our first question is sort of looking at seeing sort of how does math anxiety differ between these relational reasoning tasks, sort of with the non-symbolic forms of SFOR and just being able to describe multiplicative relations, and the formal fraction tasks. And then also how SFOR and math anxiety are related to symbolic fraction magnitude knowledge, not magnitude. Sorry about that. Yes. So we had 405th and 6th grade students that participated in the study, about evenly split between the two grades, about evenly split with male and female. In terms of curriculum in Finland, these are Finnish students, and so in 5th and 6th grade, they'll have at least, and this is the beginning of 5th and 6th grade, so the 5th graders will have completed sort of at least 1 year of sort of instruction that included some fraction magnitude knowledge, and the 6th graders will have completed 2 years of that. They're introduced in 3rd grade, so it's in general they have some background knowledge. Yeah, but we get a wide range of skill across those 2 grades. What did we measure in terms of relational knowledge? Our non-symbolic tasks were this 4 task, where we gave this task and asked them to describe in as many ways as possible how the items have changed. Notice we don't say mathematically or any, the context is not a mathematical context. This task is given before any other mathematics task. They are told that this is about their thinking and reasoning, that they're solving this task, and it's not. So we see that there's a lot of variation in terms of what they pay attention to, and but some of them do use exact multiplicative relational descriptions, such as 3 times as many or half, or other kinds of part whole multiplicative relations. We all put that together, but they have to be explicitly mathematical and explicit in their description of the mathematical relations. So just saying more isn't sort of sufficient in our opinion. We also give a sort of what we call a guided task, where we guide them to the mathematical nature of the task and see if they can describe the multiplicative relations after we do that. So we ask them to describe the mathematics that they see in the picture. So this is still a non-symbolic task, but it is explicitly mathematical. The symbolic tasks included fraction arithmetic, fraction ordering, 3 or 4 fractions with common or uncommon denominators, and a whole number of arithmetic tasks that was missing value. So we didn't just have, because they're 5th and 6th graders, we wanted to challenge them a little bit with having a hard task that wasn't about fractions, basically, something that is a little bit challenging for them. So it was a whole number missing value. So, 4 plus blank equals 11, what's the blank? And then we had 2 aspects of math anxiety. We had a general math anxiety measure where they responded in terms of their overall anxiety doing different kinds of in mathematics in general. And then we had a task-specific math anxiety question. So after they did this 4 task, the multiplicative relations task, fraction arithmetic, and whole number arithmetic, we asked them to explicitly say how much that previous task caused them anxiety. So it was task specific. And what we found with this task specific anxiety, that there was obviously differences in the tasks. So that with the non-mathematically explicit task, where there wasn't necessarily mathematics embedded, some may notice it, some didn't, there was lower anxiety for the students. The non-symbolic multiplicative relations and the whole number arithmetic had similar values of, I can show you they had similar values, but were higher than 4. And then the fraction arithmetic had the highest. Although you can see this scale is, if anyone knows how to change scales in JASP, by the way, let me know. The scale is condensed. So this was on a scale from 1 to 5. And we see that overall pretty low anxiety levels and pretty small differences between the tasks, even though it was statistically significant. Importantly, when we look at the difference between the non-symbolic and the symbolic relational reasoning, we see that there is an increase of about 0.15 on the scale from 1 to 5. So really not a substantial increase if you really consider it. The next thing we wanted to do is look at how task-specific anxiety and performance were related to each other. And what we found was that there was absolutely no relation between performance and task-specific anxiety on SFOR. Not surprising, because, well, yeah, it was not, we wouldn't expect it to elicit too much anxiety except for the uncertainty in the task. But there's plenty of ways to solve it non-mathematically. So But we also didn't see it once the task became mathematically explicit. There was no relation there, nor was there a relation on the formal fraction arithmetic. So we didn't see any relation between their task-specific anxiety and their performance on this task. But we did see a strong negative correlation or moderate negative correlation between task-specific anxiety for the whole number arithmetic. And all of these relations held up after controlling for overall math anxiety. Finally, we wanted to look at predicting their performance on the fraction ordering task, the fraction magnitude task, based on their non-symbolic skills for their other math skills and fraction anxiety. So if we first inputted just their sort of math skills, their ability to describe multiplicative relations, their whole number arithmetic, and their fraction arithmetic, we see that they all are significantly predicting, though you see that none of these are very strong predictors, considering this is within math tasks. If we add in then S4 and fraction anxiety, S4 is predicting, but again, fairly small, a fairly weak relation. If we look at the standardized coefficients. And overall, there's not a lot of variance in fraction magnitude explained by this set of predictors. But we do see that fraction anxiety isn't related, as we saw before. So it's not really clear the specific role of math anxiety in the transition to formal fractions. There were small differences, but not very strong effects of the math anxiety differences between the non-symbolic and the symbolic tasks. And that's not really taking into account task difficulty. So those small differences might just be due to that. Although we did see that for the whole number arithmetic there, which had similar levels of difficulty, those were on the same level as the non-symbolic relational task, the multiplicative relations task. Yeah, and we didn't see any sort of interference of math anxiety on S4 or multiplicative relational reasoning, kind of as expected with S4, but interesting to see also with multiplicative relational reasoning that sort of using everyday language to describe the multiplicative relations didn't seem to be difficult, or didn't seem to be eliciting or being influenced by math anxiety. And obviously, yeah, one of the things that we want to look into a little bit more now is this performance and anxiety in co-development. Particularly, it was interesting that there wasn't a relation between anxiety and fraction arithmetic. And one possibility is the natural number bias there, that if students feel that they are actually being successful on the task because they know a way to solve it, that they are using sort of this, the approach of just adding across and feeling that that's successful, then maybe that doesn't elicit anxiety, but it sure gets them the wrong answer. Yes, I think I used all my time now, but thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. So does Hilma, who unfortunately couldn't be here, but you can get in touch with her at that email address and she'd be happy to answer questions. And also to our funders, thanks a lot. Yes.
Thank you, Jake. Please do type your questions on the chat. Otherwise, you can just speak up.
I have a question. What was the math anxiety measure that you used?
Very good question. And you'll have to give me a second. These are some of the details that I am personally, yeah, it was, so it was a FACES scale that they used. It was it based on Sorvo et al. So I'm just looking at the Finnish translations and trying to do that kind of in my head. But yeah, I can get back to you with the specific details of that if needed. Yeah, but and I'm not sure Mina either could answer that. Sorry, but also, oh, Hilma is here. Maybe she has his answer if she's able to.
Yeah, the general math anxiety was 9 items that were based on mathematical situations and anxiety caused by mathematical situations. This was based on this kind of a previous study. It's based on Dauker's mathematics anxiety scales, and it has been previously been done in primary school children by Sorvo et al. 2017. So we adapted it from that. And there are these 9 questions about mathematical situations. And some of the questions we included some fraction question in there as well, their anxiety about fractions. And then the situational anxiety questions that were asked after the task included the spaces scale, where students were supposed to assess their level of anxiety from basically low anxiety to high anxiety, with these phases starting from low anxiety and then increasing in level of anxiety. And it was basically from 1 to 5. And there was like 5 different phases from low anxiety to more higher anxiety. I hope that was answered to the question.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Hilma.
Great. Now we turn to our last speaker, Miriam. Yeah, take it away.
Thank you, Yunji, for organizing this session, and thank you all for attending and giving me this opportunity to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing at the Mathematics, Reasoning, and Learning Lab at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. So the title of my talk had been Relations Between Proportional Reasoning, Fraction Comparison, and Inhibitory Control in Adults. And since we submitted the abstract, we were actually able to collect some data from middle school students. So I think that'll hopefully help us kind of fill in a bit of the developmental trajectory here. So in our lab, we're generally interested in understanding how basic cognitive capacities like executive functions support math, cognition, and other higher cognitive skills. And we particularly use an individual difference approach in this work. So lately, we've been very interested in the role of inhibitory control on rational numbers. And our working hypothesis here is that part of what makes rational numbers so difficult is the fact that many properties of rationals contradict students' prior knowledge about whole numbers. And we've already talked about whole number bias. And so from this perspective, our interest in proportional reasoning or non-symbolic fraction comparison comes from this robust phenomena illustrated in the spinner's task. So if you ask children to compare proportions represented as continuous proportions, they do very well above chance, even for children as young as 4. However, if you take that same proportion and divide it up into sections, and the segment information, the counting information held by the number of segments contradicts the proportional information, performance plummets. So 4 out of 8 segments is more likely to be selected than 3 out of 5. And in terms of executive functions, we've particularly focused on response inhibition. And if anyone's interested in response inhibition versus semantic inhibition, I'd be happy to talk about that. But one of the reasons we've used it is that we can use the hearts and flowers task, which can be used in young children to measure response inhibition. And so in this task, students have to press on the same side when they see hearts and the opposite side when they see flowers, and they do a block of congruent and then incongruent and then a mixed block. And we found in second grade children that performance on this mixed block is significantly positively correlated with performance on this discrete or discretized misleading task. And by contrast, it doesn't correlate with performance on this continuous task. So we take this as evidence that inhibitory control is supporting performance on this kind of task. I will note, however, that there is a positive effect here, and the difference between these effects is not significant. So it's also possible that inhibitory control is just generally supporting proportional reasoning. Now, as mentioned by many others today, part of the reason of interest in these non-symbolic processes is because of their potential to act as a foundation for symbolic fraction understanding. And one recent paper that I'd like to bring your attention to from Begley and colleagues looked at 3 different ways of presenting non-symbolic ratios: continuously discretized, so broken up, or discrete, where it's completely separate items. and they used a matched task similar to ones we've seen already. And they looked at performance on this compared to a pretty comprehensive fraction assessment with number lines and arithmetic and comparison. And what they found was that all three tasks positively correlated strongly with performance on the fraction assessment. So this would not be surprising given the work on the RPS, but this is interesting, particularly because this was the strongest comparison. And so for us, it raises the possibility that part of what a task like this might be carrying is maybe the proportional information and access to it that the continuous task does, but also the need for inhibitory control both in symbolic fraction tasks and in these non-symbolic formats. So our research questions for this study were, first, does inhibitory control specifically contribute to these misleading discrete proportional stimuli? And I'll just show you our full stimuli design. We had these counting misleading stimuli, which could be either in the discrete or the continuous format. And we had counting compatible ones, which I'll show you overall performance, but we're generally going to focus on these misleading ones. And we use these labels here, even though, of course, for the continuous case, there's nothing compatible or misleading. They can do it in either case. And we also added in from the original Jiang stimuli, a symbolic version of this task. So the same 12 stimuli now represented as fractions. And so here we're also now can ask questions about whether performance on either the continuous or the discrete support performance on the symbolic task, and does inhibitory control support symbolic task, as we found in other tasks. So our participants here are 85 college students, and this data was collected pre-pandemic, so in person. And the middle schoolers, our current sample is 47, and we have plans for more data collection. And because of some details of the way our data collection happened, we don't currently have gender and age information, although we know that they're 7th and 8th grade students. And so because of that, I'm not going to be presenting any direct statistical comparisons between the groups. This will be more of a sort of general developmental story. So how do they do on these tasks? Well, combining our data from the previous publication in second graders, middle schoolers, and adults, we can see that there's a strong improvement in this task in the continuous case. And what you're seeing here are means, and then these are clouds of the distribution of performance on the task. And we can see it improves in middle school, but no real sort of further improvement into adulthood, whether this just represents differences between our samples or the engagements of students in school versus undergrads in the participant pool, I can't say. But a similar pattern continues when we look at the discretized stimuli, that again, there's strong improvements to middle school, and then adults are pretty flat, although there may be some sort of continued improvement on the challenging, misleading stimuli. And in terms of our executive function, we again see that the adults are really not actually doing much better, although the median may be higher and there just may be more kind of stragglers on this side. So we have very similar task performance between the middle schoolers and the adults. And now we can ask, well, how do these constructs, continuous and discrete and executive function, relate to each other in these time ranges? So we were interested to first note that inhibitory control as measured by the Hearts and Flowers test did not predict performance on these discrete misleading trials. Interestingly, it did predict on the continuous misleading, although the difference between them is not significant. So this maybe suggests that there's just a general contribution of inhibitory control, but it's not necessarily in this task specific to these misleading ones. There's also a size manipulation in this task where the correct proportion is sometimes the smaller spinner and sometimes the larger. And so that may require sort of general engagement of inhibitory control kind of across all of the tasks. Interestingly, though, in the middle schoolers, we do see the expected relationship between discrete misleading and inhibitory control, but it also shows up again for the continuous misleading. So we're not seeing the specificity we would expect. Again, no difference. And so now we can turn to the key question of, do these non-symbolic relationships predict performance on our symbolic comparison task? And we find here that both the discrete misleading and the continuous misleading positively predict. We don't see the effect as found in Begley and colleagues that there's stronger effects for discrete than misleading. They seem to be equal. And then in adults, there's no relationship at all. So it really, whatever effect it's had in middle school, it seems as if it's wearing off by the time you get to adulthood. And finally, we can look at whether the inhibitory control task predicts symbolic performance. And although we see a trend in that direction for middle school, although it's not significant, I think this may just be a sample size effect. Because there's no difference between this effect and other effects which are significantly correlating with executive function of inhibitory control. And in adults, we do see a strong relationship. So that tells us that, at least in adults, inhibitory control is important for symbolic fraction comparison when it contradicts your whole number knowledge. So there's a lot of correlations I've just thrown at you. So let me summarize them. So in our first question of inhibition and for these specific discrete misleading stimuli, we see an effect in middle schools, but it's not specific. And in adults, we see no effect. When we turn to our non-symbolic stimuli, we see an effect in middle school for both continuous and discrete. And again, no effect in adults. And then for the inhibitory control, we see a weak effect for middle schoolers and a strong effect for adults. So really for adults, the only thing that seems to matter is their inhibitory control, whereas for middle school students, all of these matter together. And so I'll summarize and then I'll give you our next steps. So we see that even though despite overall levels of performance between the adults and the middle schoolers, there's a very different pattern of the relationship between the constructs, where everything predicted for middle school and really only inhibitory control for in adults. And so one idea that we're thinking about here is this would be consistent with some ideas that Ian Lyons and others have put forward of this kind of semantic estrangement, where in whole numbers, number symbols are initially kind of grounded in their non-symbolic representations, but then they come to have an abstract meaning which is separate from their non-symbolic performance. And what's interesting here is, of course, this definitely, our results contradict all of the work that we've seen from Matthews and Hubbard and others that seem to show this RPS is related to symbolic. It may be the case that our task is sort of this very tight thing, and non-symbolic magnitude may be sort of still contributing to larger understanding, but maybe not necessarily in the exact stimuli. Definitely more work to be done there. And we also are seeing this evidence for the continuing role of inhibitory control in rational number processing, consistent with our previous work we just published on decimal comparison, and work that some of you may have seen a couple of weeks ago in this Zoom session from MCLS, showing again a relationship for fractions in middle school and elementary school students. So next steps is we really need to look at whether there are independent contributions of continuous and discrete and inhibitory control. And one interesting idea that we're going to pursue is it may be the case that what we're capturing in our relationship with discrete proportional reasoning is also some of that role of inhibitory control. And that might be separate from a more general magnitude processing that maybe the continuous task is capturing. And so one detail about our stimuli is that they're not really set up to get at this question of magnitude processing and whether there are distance effects. There's only essentially 6 stimuli in each condition. And so we're working now on new stimuli that we've put together using that stacked bar graph format to look at this question of magnitude processing and non-symbolic and symbolic performance, which we're hopefully going to look at in the brain potentially. So I'll end with thanking my team. So Roberto Abreu-Mendoza led all of this work, and the work in adults was done by Lindsay Coulange and undergraduate research assistants. And the data for middle schoolers comes from the Mathematical Thinkers Like Me project, which is funded by the EF Plus Math program, and of course, the participants. All right, and I'll stop there.
Right on time. Thank you, Miriam. I believe we can have like a couple more minutes to get questions. If you have any questions, please put on the chat or please speak up.
I had a small clarification question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Mhm.
Can you explain the misleading continuous stimuli to me again? Because yeah, how was it misleading, I guess, is my main question.
Yeah, I went over that quickly. It's not misleading. It's just the continuous version of the misleading stimuli.
Okay.
And they're matched for distance. They're slightly harder in terms of distance than the compatible stimuli. And you maybe saw that there's like a slight effect where those stimuli are a little bit harder overall. And so that's one of the things we're trying to correct in our new stimuli.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I would like to wrap up our symposium. Thanks for all the speakers. It was amazing presentations. And then thank you all for coming to our symposium. I hope this is a good time to think over about like how we can best support our children in terms of fractional knowledge. And yeah, thank you for coming to our symposium again.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you
for all the
organizing.
presentations.
That was amazing presentations. Thank you all. I think we can say goodbye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Hey.